Well, good day, and welcome to our Luke Bible class. I intentionally greet you with good day because I don't know what time of day you might be watching this. We're continuing our study from the Gospel of Luke. We're continuing under these rather unusual circumstances where we're confined to our homes. We are in quarantine, self quarantine, and so it's just unusual times. And we're just going to continue to move on as best we can. And we certainly want to continue on with our study from God's Word. And I didn't want to make this a disruption of the study of Luke that we've been engaged in now for a while here at Center Hill. And so we continue on today. We are going to be looking at the section that's found in chapter 12, beginning in verse 13 and going through verse 53. And we're going to follow the procedure that we have used previously in that. We'll go through and we'll look at these sections that are in this portion of Luke and look at them individually, and then go back and try to get like a 30,000 foot view, if you will. Just kind of see, okay, what's Luke up to here? What is he showing us in the life and the ministry of Jesus? And I think both of those perspectives are very good and very necessary for us to get the message, I think, that is intended to be communicated here. So we start with looking at each individual section, which begins in verse 13 of chapter 12 through verse 21, where I happen to be using the Bible or looking at the Bible that we've distributed in our class, which is the Scripture Journal. It's an English Standard Version, and there are, in the English Standard Version, these section headings. So verses 13 through 21, the parable of the rich fool. And so someone in the crowd says to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possession." And then he follows that up with a parable. You might remember that as we began back at the beginning of this quarter, this section of Luke, the vast majority of the parables recorded in Luke are found from the very end of chapter 9 all the way through about the end of chapter 17. That's where they're concentrated. And so here is a parable. And this is one of those parables that is found exclusively in Luke. You don't find this in Matthew, Mark, or John. And so the parable of the rich fool, in which he tells about a man, a landowner, whose crops did outstanding. He had a bumper crop. And so he was pondering what to do about this. I have this excess of produce from my land, but I have no place to put it. And so his decision was, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and I'll store my grain and my goods there. And when that's all done, I'll be able to say to myself, "Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But God says to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be?" So this is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So another one of these times in which Luke gives us a quotation from somebody from the crowd, these crowds that are always following Jesus. And he asks Jesus, "Jesus, I want you to intervene into this family situation we have." I guess one way we could say this, he's asking Jesus, "Would you fix my brother? He's not acting right in this regard." And Jesus refuses. Jesus does not honor all requests made of him. And that's a good lesson for us to learn. We're not obligated to honor every request that is made of us. And that for a variety of reasons. We're not going to go down that path, but Jesus does not take the bait, if you will. He doesn't go there with this man. As a matter of fact, he kind of redirects the whole situation, because this is a a question that has to do with finances. There's an inheritance involved, and one brother feels like he's getting cheated, and the other apparently does not, or he does, but he's got control of it. Whatever that circumstance is, it's also interesting to notice that there is nothing said here about who's right or wrong in this. Which brother is correct? Well, we don't know that because he doesn't tell us that, and that's not the issue here. That Jesus doesn't go down that path, but rather he shifts it to what is an underlying and even more critical issue of concern, and that has to do with attitude towards things. And so he says, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And what a telling statement, particularly in our culture. Now, at this very moment in time, this might not seem to be quite the as much an issue or as poignant an issue as at other times, but man, we've been living at a time of tremendous prosperity. The stock market has just record gains, and it just reaches higher and higher highs. And so the abundance of possessions is more of a reality, a possibility and reality now than it has ever been. It's hard for us as Americans to really appreciate that because we're living in the middle of it. But you compare our prosperity as a nation to the rest of the world, and man, if you've got electricity and running water and you've got food in your cabinet, you are among the most wealthiest people in the world. So back to Jesus' point here. A man's life, that's not the measure of a person's life, the abundance of possessions, and yet that's the measure that we tend to always use. And so he tells the parable of the rich fool. And there are several things about that. Primarily the fact that here's a man who has more than enough. He has excess. And so his thought about that is to keep it. They're my crops, they're my goods, they're my possessions, and I am keeping them for my pleasure, my enjoyment, my security, however you want to think about that. And Jesus, as he was so skilled at doing, he really brings home the point when he says that very night, the Lord pronounces this man a fool and requires his life. That is, the man dies that night. Okay, so you've died now. Whose are these things now? This is what your whole life was built around, and now your life on this earth has come to an end. So what happens next? This is, I think, a tremendous parable in helping to give perspective, and of course, Jesus' parables certainly did that for us. But if you got to the point in this parable when he says, okay, the man's crops produced bountifully, what shall I do? I'm going to tear down my barns, I'm going to build bigger barns. He does that apparently, and he gets everything stored up, and he says, now, I have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax. Take pleasure. Be at ease. And does that not fit precisely the mind thought or the mindset, the way of thinking that we have in our own modern culture? That's the goal? That we work our whole lives in order to be able to say, okay, now I can relax. Now I've got everything I need. It's time to relax. It's time to enjoy. That is pretty much a definition of the American way of life, or at least the intended American way of life. And yet Jesus just cuts the legs out from under that. He says, okay, so you achieve that. And many people do achieve that. And it certainly isn't that we should not work to provide some sort of stability for our lives in this regard. But Jesus says, okay, but what else? And we're going to notice this when we go to the 30,000 foot view and we look at this incident and then the next teaching that's recorded here. But he concludes this with that statement: so is the one who lays up treasure for himself, but is not rich toward God. And that's just something that is not often thought about today. Our culture certainly doesn't proclaim that kind of a message about being rich toward God, and yet that's precisely what Jesus is doing. So notice where he went. This all started with this man who said, Jesus, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he shifts the perspective on that. And so that's not really the issue here, Jesus said, but rather the issue is, how are you even thinking about possessions? What would you do with that inheritance if you received it? And would it be for ultimately your good and your benefit? Okay, well, let's continue on here. This next section begins in verse 22 and goes all the way through verse 34. And we find some teaching of Jesus that we're familiar with, but probably more familiar with it as we know it from the Sermon on the Mount. And we've made this point before in this study. I think it's not a pointless pursuit, but I think the benefits gained from a pursuit of trying to match up and say that these two teachings of Jesus or these two records of an incident are the same thing and they're being addressed from different perspectives, although that does happen. I'm not denying that at all, but I think we have to also bring into that equation the possibility that Jesus taught these things more than once. And what Matthew records is how he taught it on this particular occasion, but what Luke's recording for us is how it was taught on another occasion. And Jesus, I'm confident Jesus repeated these messages many times. He just didn't teach the content of the Sermon on the Mount one time in one place, but rather he taught these things in multiple places. So I say that as we begin to look at this familiar teaching. I tell you, don't be anxious about your life, what you'll eat, about your body, what you'll put on, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet the Father feeds them. And how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his lifespan? If you then are not able to do a small thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil or spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you're to eat or what you're to drink, and don't be worried, for all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. And so, Jesus' teaching in regard to, we call it anxiety or worry. Don't worry about these things, and these are some pretty fundamental things, aren't they? These are things like the food you're going to eat and the clothes you're going to wear. And again, the circumstance and situation in which we presently live, we're not concerned about whether or not we have clothes to wear. We're concerned about whether or not they're stylish enough, or whether they're new enough, or whether they're this or that. We've got closets and dressers full of clothes. Jesus was speaking to people whose concern was more for, okay, I have this garment, how long is it going to last me? And the same thing with food. We've been in the last several days, last couple of weeks, being concerned about having enough food present in our homes. We're stockpiled. with food. Our cabinets, our refrigerators are full to overflowing. He was talking to people who they lived day to day. They lived hand to mouth kind of an existence. And he's telling those people in that circumstance, don't worry. Don't worry about these things. God takes care of things like birds and the grass of the field. He is going to take care of you. I think there's a great contrast being set up here by Luke between this teaching of Jesus and the previous teaching of Jesus, and we're going to look at that here in just a moment or two. But these are things you ought not to be anxious about, because your concern is first and foremost on the kingdom of God. And if your concern is first and foremost in the kingdom of God, then understand and know that God is going to provide for you. Jesus obviously here is not teaching irresponsibility. He's not teaching us that we should do nothing in regard to the necessities of life. As a matter of fact, one of the ways God blesses us and God gives to us is by providing for us the opportunities to go to work, the opportunities to make money, to have the opportunities to go to a place where we can purchase the goods and the services that we need in life. And so God provides in that way many times. But the whole point, I want you to notice here in verse 29, I want you to look at the word seek. Do not seek what you are to eat or to drink, or be worried. For the nations of the world seek these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek, verse 31, His kingdom, and these things will be added to you. So what are you seeking in life? Are you seeking the kingdom? And that's where Jesus here, I think, is trying to shift the thinking of people away from these physical things of life that sometimes they just don't seem to be as abundant as we would like for them to be, or readily available as we would like for them to be, or we don't have lined up in my mind how these things are going to keep coming. We're unsure about that stuff, and so we become concerned about that. Our attentions, our energies, our desires come to be focused then on those things. We're seeking those things, and that puts us in a class with the rest of the world. All the nations of the world think in this exact same way, and Jesus says you need to be different. You need to be different. Your seeking needs to be of the kingdom of God, and God, who is your Father and who has given ample evidence even in the world around you of His provisions for His creation, your Father, He will take care of you. Now let's finish this up starting in verse 32. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the needy, provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. This is Jesus. Jesus knows how people are going to respond to this kind of an idea and this kind of teaching, and they're fearful. It makes them afraid. But in one sense, this is Jesus encouraging us to put our full confidence and trust in God to provide for us and to care for us, because it is His good pleasure to give us the kingdom. He is inviting us into that relationship with Him, with His Son as King, and He's the Father. He's in control of this. This is His realm of authority and power, and where He exercises His goodwill, and He's invited us to be a part of that, which means then something that's going to have to happen is we're going to have to be willing to turn loose of all of this anxiety and worry over these earthly things that everybody else in the world thinks about. Even those people, especially those people, I guess, who don't know God as their Father. And that's why I think back up in verse 28, he makes that. Again, it's a familiar statement from Jesus, but let's not lose the force of it. Oh, you of little faith. Obviously, that's not the kind of people we want to be. We don't want that assessment of us spiritually, that our faith is little. Let's keep going. So beginning in verse 35, stay ready, dressed for action, keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. So Jesus, he shifts or Luke does, as he collects these teachings of Jesus together, he shifts the line of thought to this one of readiness and preparedness for the Lord's return. Now, I think we have to remember that these disciples, in a lot of ways, they're not going to get this. And what I mean by that is, think about the apostles when Jesus, there in the upper room just before his death, is trying to describe for them and explain to them that he's going away. I go to prepare a place for you. I'm leaving. And they're like, where are you going? Where are you going? This idea of the Lord leaving and coming back was a foreign concept to them. And so my question, or a question that I have here, is just how much did these people get this? That where he talks about when the master returns, when he comes back, and that was a head scratcher for them, I'm sure. But you and I understand this, and he puts this in a social, cultural context of the wedding, very different from our weddings. You can look this up online and find descriptions of first century ancient Jewish and Greek Roman wedding ceremonies and procedures. It's not this singular event, but it's a series of activities. It begins with the betrothal that comes ahead of time that could last up to a year, and then when the time's coming, then you have the preparation of the bride in her father's house, and then with all of her attendants, and then there is the procession from her house, her father's house, to the house of her groom, the man that she is going to marry. And so this is oftentimes done at night, late evening, whatever. It's a torchlight procession. It's a very joyous occasion and a lot of merriment and those kinds of things. And they go, and so then there is that aspect of it. Then there is the receiving of the bride into the groom's home. That was kind of a formal thing as well. And then there would be this feast that would last, upwards of a week, in which a lot of guests were invited, a lot of party crashers would show up, people that weren't necessarily invited, but it was such a joyous occasion. And so we have this scene of a master who has gone to a wedding. So you don't know how long he's going to stay, you don't know how long he's going to be there, and he's going to come back. Okay, so what about the servants? What about this master's servants? Are they ready for him when he returns? Blessed are those servants who the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table. He will come and serve them. And if he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. So these people understood this. They understood this concept of these servants being ready for when their master comes, and they're prepared for him. They're watching. They're even if it's in the middle of the night, they're ready for that. Know this, that if the master of the house had known, he kind of shifts pictures here, although the point is the same. If the master had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. So a thief's arrival in a home is unannounced. And so is the arrival of the master back to his home that's been at the wedding feast. So the whole idea is preparing for that, for which you don't know the timing of it. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you have to be ready. So you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. And so Peter says, Lord, you're telling this parable for us, or are you telling this parable for us or for all? And so Jesus, he kind of continues with this line of thought. Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master has set over his household to give them their portion of food and at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. So when the master comes back, he finds this servant doing the things that he put him in charge to be doing in his absence. This isn't necessarily the same wedding feast picture, but just the master leaves, and to keep affairs in order while he's gone, he's put this servant in charge. So what does he find when he comes back? Well, he says, what if the servant says to himself, my master is delayed? He begins to beat the male and female servants to eat and drink and get drunk. He just uses all this that the master has provided for him for his own pleasure, for his own good. And if the master comes back, he says, before that, this statement in verse 46, the master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect and at an hour that he does not know. Now, some pretty strong language from Jesus here. And if he finds this servant that he's put in charge just getting drunk, beating the other slaves, those kinds of things, he said he will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful, and the servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. Jesus is driving the point home. There are very serious consequences when we fail to be ready for our Lord's return, and we fail to be busying ourselves in doing His will. Don't think that's just going to be passed over lightly. This is serious business, and Jesus uses some very strong language to get that point across. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. So there is a difference between the one who knew better and was equipped to do better but didn't do it, and the one who didn't know yet still failed to do what the master wanted. But you'll notice that both of those receive punishment. Now, we're not going to get into the whole issue of degrees of reward and punishment, although Jesus seems to open the door on that thought here. Now, I'm going to draw any hard and fast conclusions from just this one particular passage, but it's there, and we've got to acknowledge that. So to everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. If you've been given much, the Lord expects much of you. We are a people who have been given much. We've been given much as far as resources and abilities and opportunities. We've been given much financially. We are blessed so greatly. And what is expected then of us is also corresponds to how greatly we have been blessed. Sobering thought, but one that Jesus is driving home now here to these people. Okay, last section, beginning in verse 49. Then we got to come back through and look at the flow of all of this together. Jesus says, I came to cast fire on the earth, and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and that is a reference to his suffering and his death. And how great is my distress until it is accomplished. We are in a time of distress right now. And it is not a lack of faith for us to acknowledge the distress that we may be in. Jesus acknowledged his distress. Now, yes, his distress was so much greater than our distress. But even so, he acknowledged it, that this was a distressing thing for him. And God knows, and there's nothing wrong with us acknowledging the fact of that fact that God already knows, is that this is a time of distress for us. Do you think that I have come to give peace on the earth? No, I tell you, rather division. From now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. They'll be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, And he gets very specific. Mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. I want to say this about that. No, I'm gonna wrap up with that. Let's go back now and look at what's been going on here in Luke's gospel, and as we move into these parts that we've just covered here for just a little bit. I see we've hit the 30-minute mark already, so I will not delay in this, although we could spend quite a bit of time here. You know, Jesus, we've noted in the last couple of studies how Jesus has tried to draw a distinction between himself and what we'll call the religious establishment that was already in place. These religious rulers, the scribes, Pharisees, lawyers, the temple worship, the sacrifices that were offered, that all of that was in place. And Jesus came and he didn't fit into that. He didn't just fit into that. He came and was very distinct from it. And it seems as though when Luke tells us that Jesus has set his mind or his face to go to Jerusalem, part of that seems to be an indication to us that Jesus has begun to bring people to this point of saying, okay, you've got a decision to make. You cannot continue to follow in what you have been taught and continue to be taught and what this establishment continues to maintain. I've brought something new. Now, Jesus has demonstrated himself to be unlike any other person that has ever walked the face of the earth. I mean, he's performing these miracles. His words and his actions are remarkable. And people are having a hard time classifying him. Well, the only logical and the only reasonable conclusion that could be reached is that this really is the Son of God. And so he should be listened to. And so Jesus has told these people, okay, you're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to decide. And if you decide to follow me, know that you're going to be ostracized and rejected and all those things. And now, though, he says it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that to the point of you're going to have to change the way you live. You're going to have to change the way you think. This isn't just about saying, okay, I make the decision in my mind, I'm going to follow Jesus. But now Jesus says, if you follow me, then there are some ways of thinking that are going to have to change in your life. And so Luke used this teaching of Jesus prompted by the man who cried out from the multitude, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. You're going to have to think differently about your life and this world and what it's all about. You can no longer think of your life as the pursuit of physical things, about the pursuit of having all that you want. And so Jesus says, okay, let's take, for example, someone who has everything they want and they achieve it. They're successful. They get it all. So what about that person? Well, they're still going to die. And if they have not used what God has provided for them on behalf of his service, the Lord's service, then what good is it? It's accomplished them nothing. And then on the heels of that, we have this teaching then about not being anxious about what you'll eat or what you'll put on, your food and your clothes and those necessities of life. Now, you can just see Jesus thinking, okay, now how many people are actually ever going to be at that place where they can be like this rich fool, that they're going to have everything they want and they can just finally say, okay, I've got it all. Just take it easy now. Eat, drink, and be merry for the rest of my life. Well, there's not many people who get to that point. Most of these people are struggling. Most of these people are living that day-to-day existence. And so what's their issue? Well, it's anxiety and worry. It's the struggle of having all of their time and attention and efforts focused on those things that's all they focus on. And so Jesus is telling them, okay, I'm bringing the kingdom, and it's God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, and he's inviting you to be a part of that. And in inviting you to be a part of that, you're putting your trust and your confidence and your faith in Him. Not in yourself and your abilities, not in your work ethic, not in any of those things, but you're putting your trust and your confidence in Him. And so what you have, however much or however little that might be, you're going to willingly use that in the service of God. Now, here, great contrast between that attitude and the attitude of the rich fool. The rich fool said, it's mine, and I'm going to accumulate it. I'm going to keep it. It's for my use, my pleasure, my stability, my relaxation and ease. But Jesus says, what you have, your attitude is, it's for whoever I encounter that has a need. It is yours. I don't think it's a mistake that he talked about how the rich fool said, I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger barns. But you look at the birds of the air, who they have no, he says, no barns or storehouses. They don't accumulate anything. They're making it through just fine because God's providing for them. And so this is a massive shift in thinking that Jesus is calling these people to. So, as well as having to turn away from what has been your traditional, historic, religious training and teaching and leadership, because it's gone askew, it's gone awry, it's gone astray. You're going to follow me. Now, that's not going to win you any friends over here, and most people aren't going to be willing to do this, but you're going to come and you're going to follow me. And so if you do that, you're going to have to be prepared. You're going to have to be ready. And so we have this whole theme through this section of the return of Jesus. As I said previously, I don't know how much these people really understood all that, but he makes it very clear that as we live this life, our preparedness and our readiness is for his return. That's what we're getting ready for. And so that when he comes, he's going to find us fulfilling his will. And that ties into all that we've just been talking about, whether or not we're fulfilling his will or not. So you be watchful. You be watchful for when he returns, because when he returns is not the time to get ready. It's past time. You must be ready when he returns. And that means you must be using what he is presently providing for you for his good and for his service and for the good of his kingdom. And then he finishes this. This is where we'll wrap up. He finishes this with, I didn't come to bring peace, but I came to bring division. He talked about how, okay, you're going to separate yourself from what most folks are. They're going to continue down the path they've been on. They're going to continue relying on the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers to provide their instruction and their guidance. And I'm telling you, you've got to separate yourself from that. You've got to get away from that. And that can be hard. But what can be even harder is the fact that you may wind up recognizing that even within your own family, there are those who are unwilling to make that change. And so you've got to be prepared for that. And you've got to be willing to follow me, despite the consequences, whether they are on a societal level or whether they're on a family level. You have to be prepared to continue to follow. Well, I've enjoyed our time to be able to be together here today. We'll continue our study, our next study, which will be our 7th class. The next one will be our 7th. This was the 6th. That one will be covering Luke chapter 12, verse 54. Start there and go through verse 17 of chapter 13. That will be made available at some time on Wednesday. And so we'll be getting messages out in that regard. And we hope that you'll be able to be a part of our study then as well. Thank you.